So the first thing we probably have to do when we think about the demand for tomatoes, or the market demand for tomatoes, is what are the factors that determine how many tomatoes you will buy when you go to the store or when you go to the farmer's market. And let's do it in a form of equation so we can start thinking more organized about these things. Let's say the quantity of tomatoes demanded or consumed, let's call that QX. It's going to be a function of those factors that determine your demand for tomato, and probably one of the main ones is the price of tomatoes. We're going to call that the price of X. Also, the price of perhaps other things, lettuce, the price of bread, or the price of macaroni, if you're going to do tomato sauce, right? So the price of all the goods that are related to tomatoes, we're going to say PY, and how much money you have, or your income, and probably your preferences, whether you like tomatoes or not, right? So we're going to call that your taste. T for taste or preference. And generally, those four things will allow us to actually say quite a bit about the demand for tomatoes. Now, when people talk about the market demand for tomatoes, they usually refer to the relationship between one of the determinants of demand, which is the price of tomatoes, and the quantity of tomatoes demanded. And they usually refer to what they call a demand schedule, which is a specific relationship between the price of tomatoes and the quantity of tomatoes demanded. And we can reflect this information in two ways. One is in a table, which have two columns, the price, the price of tomatoes, PX, and the quantity of tomatoes at each price. So for instance, when the price of tomatoes is, let's say, 0, let's say that you will demand 10 tomatoes, and when the price of tomatoes goes up to $2, you'll demand a little less tomatoes. And when the price of tomatoes goes up to $4, you demand even less tomatoes. And when the price of tomatoes goes up to $6, you demand even less, even more. And this reflects what we call about the law of demand, which is that when the price increases, the quantity of tomatoes demanded decreases. And we can continue in the same fashion until we actually increase the price enough to actually reduce the demand of tomatoes to 0. At the price of 10, you wouldn't buy tomatoes. And then, so we call this little relationship between price and demand a demand schedule. And this could be formed in a table, or we can take the same numbers and put them in a graph with quantity on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis. And we can just plot the numbers the same way. When the price of tomatoes is 10, it's 0, you demand 10 tomatoes. When the price of tomatoes is 10, you demand 0 tomatoes. And all the other combinations are sort of in that same, in the same line. When the price of tomatoes is 8, you demand 2 tomatoes, so that will be the second point. When the price of tomatoes is 6, you demand 4 tomatoes. When the price of tomatoes is 4, you demand 6 tomatoes, and so forth and so forth. And by connecting all those points, then you have the same information in what we call the demand curve. Now notice that the demand curve and the demand table show exactly the same thing. It's just two different ways of showing the information. And the demand curve eventually is going to be a lot more useful for us to generalize particular things about demand and henceforth the supply too. All right. So this also allows us to see what happens when the price of tomatoes increase. So let's say you're at a price of $6 and the price of tomatoes increased to $4. Well, you see that when the price of tomatoes is $6, you'll consume 4 tomatoes, and when the price of tomatoes decreases to $4, what happens is that you will demand more tomatoes than before. So your value or how much you like tomatoes haven't really changed, but since the tomatoes are now cheaper, you're able to buy more tomatoes. That's all that's happening here. And we can see that in in the curve, which is basically you're going to move from one point to the curve to a new point in the curve. Or we can see that in the table, what you're doing is you're going to move from one point of the table, one row of the table, to a different row of the table. Right? So what happens is that when the price of tomato changes, you move down or up on the table, or down or up along the demand curve. But that's going to be different than when the other determinants of demand change. So in the next little video, we're going to see what are the effects of a change, an effect on the demand schedule or the change of any of the other determinants of demand.